Topic here is Charlie Wilson's War. Some of the photographs about Charlie Wilson and his journey through Afghanistan and Pakistan as he tries to form an alliance with Abdullah Azam, the leader of the Mujahideen, who eventually becomes one of the founding leaders of the idea that Al Qaeda would subscribe to, which makes him bin Laden's mentor. Find this picture fascinating. Charlie Wilson with some anti-aircraft weapon. It's just interesting that a congressman is in the battle zone, wearing, clothing from the Mujahideen and, just firing a weapon. Here are some of the main players in the film, the actual people and the actors in the film. So in the early 80s, there's a lot going on with regard to some long-term connections to 9/11. For example, the 1983 barracks bombing, which has some significant consequences for South Brunswick. Here you see Sean Essler, who died in that particular attack. Maybe you could say it's one of the first attacks on the United States. If you want to throw in the Iran hostage crisis, maybe that counts as yet another. So there's definitely a lot going on with some of the long-term connections. So pretty much Lebanon is involved in a civil war that's going on, which prompts numerous nations to get involved. Israel being one, and Israel and Lebanon had fought a war in the 40s. Remember Israel's war for independence. What does that have to do with Afghanistan? Well, I'm just trying to get you to think about some of the long-term connections to 9/11. For example, Zaidi Jarrah, he was from Lebanon. And so, in 1975, when this individual was born, he's 26 on 9/11, which is why I bring up this particular item, because that was addressed in the film on some level. So you were asked to complete this sheet for the film, or do a reflection, or answer the questions from the reading. Any of those items count. So these questions here, does the U.S. have a responsibility to the Afghan people? I guess that's up to debate. If you're answering this question saying yes, maybe that's a result of your understanding of how there are some long-term connections to 9/11. We did the math in class. In the film, they talked about people in Afghanistan, half the age being under 14, and that's in 1989. So I just did the math. If you take 14 and you add 11, 89 to 2001, you come up with 26, and the average age of the hijackers is 25. Again, the only reason why that is important is because the 9/11 hijackers, mainly the leaders, Mohammed Atta, Shihi, I wouldn't count Hani Hajor as a leader, Zaid Jarrah, these individuals eventually find themselves in Afghanistan. And when they find themselves in Afghanistan, they are being influenced by a lot of the leadership of the Mujahideen, bin Laden, Dr. Fatal, al-Zahari, Zakari. All of these individuals are playing a role in influencing the minds of these individuals. And then the 9/11 hijackers, just another side note, I think it's 14 out of 19 come from Saudi Arabia. As you see here, Saudi national, Saudi national, Saudi national. And I put a reference here to Khashoggi. You might be familiar with the Khashoggi murder. One of the things maybe you did not know, around the time Khashoggi was killed, there was also a lot of talk in the United States. I want to say that the U.S. government was going to allow the victims of 9/11, family members and things like people like that, to sue Saudi Arabia. I haven't really followed that story, but what I do know is that Khashoggi was instrumental in trying to connect Saudi Arabia to the 9/11 attacks. So there is speculation that maybe that's the result of why he was murdered. In the film, they address the issue about the ball keeps bouncing, and Charlie Wilson addresses that. The ball keeps bouncing, which kind of connects to the question here whether or not the U.S. has an obligation to continue to put aid in Afghanistan after the Soviet-Afghan war. So the ball just keeps on bouncing. It's a reference to the people that are fighting in Afghanistan. They're going to be continued fighting in Afghanistan. Eventually, the Taliban would come to power. The Taliban would give access to Al Qaeda to physically stay in Afghanistan. And so the ball that he's talking about is that ball of violence that is continuing in Afghanistan, possibly. And he was right on that. He's asking for money from Congress. And I throw the question in there, is there an ISIS ball? Now, those of you familiar with ISIS nowadays, maybe you did not know, but that group was led in the early 2000s by al-Zarqawi, who was the leader of a group called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Now, al-Zarqawi was really not affiliated with Al-Qaeda, like he wasn't, part of the ideology. There was tension supposedly between Zarqawi and Bin Laden, where there was a view that maybe Zakari was going to implement a genocide of Shia Muslims in Iraq, and a couple of other items. But what's interesting here, when I bring up the issue about the ISIS ball, when he's killed, that leads to the group ISIS. So I'm always cautious. Here's a photograph of the United States showing the killing of, al-Zakari. And so whenever it's weird, whenever there seems to be a high-ranking Al-Qaeda or ISIS official killed, it usually leads to some sort of attack in the United States. So the Islamic State, which is a result of this individual's murder, you start to see its influence and how they are trying to gain control of the region. ISIS wants to control a historic region called the Levant, and their influence, I guess this is a map from 2015, so it depends on what year and when you're looking at the map of ISIS. Anyway, the reason why I bring that up, when we talk about the ball, okay, so you kill al-Zakari, and then al-Baghdadi becomes the leader of a new organization called ISIS, very similar to the Mujahideen, morphing into a group called Al-Qaeda. And so when this individual was killed, you also start to see a situation where beheadings start to increase. I do not suggest anybody look up Jihadi John, but what I will say is that when Jihadi John was killed, there definitely was an attack that occurred after. So here is a drone strike image of the United States trying to target Jihadi John, and when he was killed, that I want to say it was the day after or 2 days after. That was when you had an attack, in Paris. And I believe this was the one at the concert. So it's weird, whenever somebody high ranking dies, what comes next is probably scarier than, the former, which is why I asked the question about, this ball keeps on bouncing. So let's move on here. Here we have yet another image of the attack that was taking place. 130 people dead and hundreds wounded. So it seems like the more, high-ranking officials you kill, the more terrorist attacks that take place. One of the people that eventually was, that they were looking for was this woman, Hasna. And she's an interesting character. She, some of her friends and her family members, they were responsible for this particular attack here. And so the police officers show up at their flat where they believe that they're staying. And, she winds up exploding. She has a bomb attached to her. And if you looked up her name and put like suicide audio, you probably could hear the audio of the last points in her life. And what's fascinating about her story is she was somebody who had become, influenced by this particular interpretation of Islam. There were some photographs of her prior to her strict conversion, and she was somebody who definitely would not be one that Saeed Qutb was supportive of, because she was somebody that was really into a Western way of life. Her drinking and her partying were all things that were raising a flag. So when she had converted to that strict interpretation, it just kind of, was, questioning by parents. If you click here, you could hear the audio link. Here's another individual that was responsible for that particular attack. How could the defeat of the Soviet Union by Muslim wars become inspiration and a golden age for warfare? I asked that question because it seems that the Soviet Union defeat, destroying the second great power in the late 80s, that is just inspiration, and that's the reason why a lot of the people in their 20s are listening to some of those, veterans from this particular conflict. The U.S. state is an interesting question. So if the United States stays in Afghanistan, could that act be viewed as Jahili? So if you don't remember this particular term here, this is the term that Saeed Qutb uses to say outside influence. So it's weird. Like if the U.S. is being criticized for staying, for leaving Afghanistan. We went to $1 billion of aid in Afghanistan. Charlie Wilson can't even get a school built. And they're going to say, well, you didn't help us after you went there as a result of the Cold War. The Cold War is over, and you kind of left us out to dry. Well, I would argue that if the U.S. also stayed there, that would then be too much influence, and we're back to the glass of water that is referenced in the Saeed cut up screencast. So this section are just items from the book Charlie Wilson's War. Think about Charlie Wilson on the night of 9/11 or the day after, thinking about some of the involvement he has played in the Mujahideen and maybe the evolution of Al Qaeda. So that's outlined in the book that I wanted you to read about. These kids are going to come home and find their families killed. I addressed this with the average age of 9/11 hijackers. I don't know if you ever thought about this, but so here they're talking about half the kids are under 14 in the Soviet-Afghan war, and these individuals, have no families. Well, I don't know if you ever thought, but kids actually were killed on 9/11. So here you see some of the victims of 9/11, just something that usually kind of goes unnoticed. Here you have somebody 2 years old from Flight 175, which means she crashed into the South Tower. If killing is killing and we're concerned about the killing of children, here we have a famous photograph from the early days of the Iraq War that was on the cover of many newspapers in the United States. Here we have killing of Americans, we have killing of Afghan children, Iraqi children, and if you're concerned about the preservation of American children, well, the Iraqis are probably going to be concerned about that, just as the people in Afghanistan are. And I don't know where that cycle kind of ends. Connect Wahhabi sect to Saeed cut up. We've addressed this in the film. Remember, the Wahhab sect are the people concerned with the purification of their religion. Here I did a Google search. It does come up, so you might be familiar with the Shia Sunni. Here's a different group. This is the Wahhab interpretation that wants to go back to a golden age of Islam, that's concerned about the purification of their religion and wants to keep outside influence out. The term blowback is usually Afghanistan comes up at 9/11 when your actions today come back to haunt you. So U.S. support for the Mujahideen in the 80s, the blowback becomes 9/11. Mm-hmm. Let's see what else we have. Take a look at this political cartoon here. That's looking at the Taliban that comes to power in Afghanistan in the 90s. They fought the British, the Russians, and now the United States. Take a look at this, $650 billion in aid. And you think about the amount of, resources and infrastructure that Afghanistan could use and build with that particular money. And so there's a feeling that the Americans, once again, as I said before, the war is over, we're done with you, Afghanistan. And think about where that leaves the people of Afghanistan. And the only motivation I have here is just to simply get you to think about those 9/11 hijackers. When you think about those 9/11 hijackers, the one thing we have to agree is that they were influenced by Al Qaeda's early leadership in the 90s. And the Al Qaeda leadership, direct connection to the 9/11 or to the Soviet-Afghan war.